Research-Sendung mit Talk, in der wir uns dem Thema Manhattan Project, Macy's, DARPA, die Erfindung des Internets, das Skynet bis hin zur God AI einfach mal ein bisschen drauf eingehen. Lasst euch überraschen. Erst müssen wir noch ein bisschen was reinziehen dazu. Vorwissen quasi. Deswegen hört ganz genau zu, schreibt mit, später gibt es Fragen dazu.
Mind can forget about it, you know. All you have to do is let things happen.
Hypnosis rolled over into the group's second presentation on the conditioned reflex, presented by psychologist Howard Liddell, who established Cornell University's Behavior Farm Laboratory, where irrational stimulus and response patterns were found to trigger artificial neurosis in sheep and other animals. A devotee of Russian physiologist Ivan Pavlov, Howard Liddell used the techniques of conditioned response that Pavlov had developed.
I'm myself somewhat of a disciple of Pavlov.
To study the conditions between the central nervous system and emotions. These experiments proved that motivations like hunger could be exploited, and the psychological response to stimulus, whether pain, fear, or reward, could be gamed to create experimentally induced neuroses, which is little different than torture. Like other Macy's attendees, Liddell had been recruited by the National Research Council, which had, with Macy's Foundation funding, formed a number of emergency committees, including a division of anthropology and psychology. It was in this spirit of marrying science and research to efforts in espionage that the meeting commenced, entangled in the secrecy and urgency of the war.
If you are working in a defense-related area, your plant must be a strong island of vigilance amid the potential security threats on every spot in our nation's defense against the spy.
But the most important conversation happened in the lunchroom when Arturo Rosenbluth told the other attendees about his work with math genius Norbert Wiener on so-called teleology and goal-seeking devices. As it turned out, the behavior of organisms and machines could be neatly and simply modeled around the feedback loop.
Habt ihr das verstanden? Die Maschine und der Mensch können beide auf denselben Feedback Loop, Rückkopplungsschleife, getriggert werden.
Margaret Mead was so riveted that she chipped a tooth, though she didn't realize it until later. She said, recalling the meeting, it was 1942.
When you really had the design of what needed to be done.
Its members dispersed to tend to their roles of wartime scientific research, but the Macy's group would not end there. 10 more Macy's conferences were planned on what the group informally called the Man-Machine Project.
Man-Machine Project von 1942. Für die meisten beginnt ja das Manhattan Project damit, dass sie denken, man hat eine Bombe gebaut. Das war ein Teil des Manhattan Projects. Aber nur ein Teil. Viele denken aber auch, das Manhattan Project endete 1945 dann. Na, Schmanski. Deswegen werden wir uns heute mal diesem Thema, ich habe da schon ein bisschen was vorbereitet, aber um den Leuten dann ein bisschen Einblick zu gönnen, müssen wir erst ein bisschen was anhören. So, Mensch, Maschine Project 1942. Norbert Wiener. Kommt nie aus Vienna, ist ein Wiener.
A new science of control based largely on Norbert Wiener's work.
An der Stelle muss man vielleicht noch dazu sagen, dass ja Lenin, Stalin, Trotzki und wie sie nicht alle hießen, die Verrückten kamen ja auch alle aus Wien. Freud kam ja auch aus Wien und Norbert Wiener kam auch aus Wien. Und sie alle machten Verhaltensstudien, Verhaltensanalyse, das Mensch-Maschine-Projekt oder den besseren Menschen. Also, damit ihr ungefähr wisst, in welche Richtung das geht.
During the First World War, Norbert Wiener studied artillery fire as a soldier and math expert with what was then primitive equipment.
1 to 4 bursts. Move along the course of your plane, keeping pace with you as the fire control instruments supply predicted firing data constantly. The target sighted, direction, angular height, and altitude readings are taken at several points along its course.
By World War II,
Das war ja damals auch eine Sache. Ne? Waffen zu erfinden, die berechnen, dorthin zu schießen, wo das Flugzeug zu einem bestimmten Zeitpunkt sein wird. Und nicht dorthin zu schießen, wo du es gerade siehst. Weil bis die Patrone ja da ist, ist das Flugzeug ja weiter. Da brauchte man mathematische Genies zur damaligen Zeit. Also es ist nicht so wie heute, dass du hier klickst und dann läuft das. Das waren damals noch Mega-Steps.
Norbert Wiener had automated anti-aircraft artillery fire, along with his partner, electrical engineer Julian Bigelow.
The anti-aircraft gunner cannot rely on dead reckoning. His leading must be a careful mathematical calculation.
It was one of the outstanding achievements of the war, improving accuracy to a science.
Whether tracked by optical sight or by radar, the information is fed by electric cable to a director.
And we now have the basic elements of a differential.
This mechanical quiz kid digests the data and automatically computes the right lead.
The other two parts.
Wenn man genau hinguckt, der Radar mit der Maschine berechnet zusammen mit den ersten Spulen quasi, wo das Geschütz hinschießt, weil es berechnet, wo das Flugzeug sein wird zu einem bestimmten Augenblick, wenn die Patrone eintreffen muss. Das sind die ersten Steps des Skynets, so gesehen. Ne? Die ersten Schritte.
Then are inputs. The sum is 6 inches.
It used automatic tracking systems that would make decisions or adjustments based on the feedback of changes in course, speed, or wind.
So they will fire not at where the target is now, but at where it will be.
It was all negative feedback, really. The calculus of the space of what hadn't quite happened yet, like a duck hunter. Wiener's goal-seeking machines would lead the target and time the intersection of the bird and the shot. The potential maneuvers are weighed and considered, then done or not done, like an arm extended to reach for a glass, moving exactly the distance needed in order to grasp it. Intricate activity in the nervous system carries out muscle contractions or muscle inhibitions countless times over, keeping the body on track to grab the water that the mind wants to drink. What if the brain worked like a computer? If so, could it be decoded and reprogrammed?
You could see from this that if you knew when to make changes and what changes to make, you could continuously defeat the predictions.
This rotund and notoriously absent-minded genius had constructed a formula for what he termed cybernetics, a phrase he had coined out of the Greek word kybernetes, or steersman. His 1948 book, underwritten by the Rockefeller Foundation and written primarily for trained scientists, summed up cybernetics as control and communication in the animal and the machine. Its popularity triggered the 1950 follow-up, The Human Use of Human Beings, Cybernetics and Society, dropping the heavy math that outlined a whole new era.
Our first assignment was communication. maintaining the nerve system of the arsenal of democracy, communication.
It was during these interwar years and at a confidential meeting in Princeton that Warren McCullough, in his words, began conspiring with Rosenbluth and Fremont Smith on the interdisciplinary meetings to follow. By the time the Macy's Conference reformed in March of 1946, they knew, in principle at least, that the brain and the computer had a common link in their operating systems. Both work through inputs and outputs, so interface should theoretically be possible. Now, technology from the war had provided a unique opportunity for researching these questions in practical terms.
The outstanding feature, in addition to the interdisciplinary approach, is a new concern for mathematical approaches to an understanding of behavior. Particularly notable are attempts to use modern information theory, automata theory, and feedback concepts in interpreting the mechanisms by which the second signal system, i.e. speech and associated phenomena, affect human behavior.
The first official Macy's Cybernetics Conference was held in March 1946, just a few months before the passage of the National Mental Health Act, which gave the federal government a new mandate, not just to treat, but prevent mental illness, establishing the National Institute of Mental Health. Known during the first 6 meetings by the longer title, Circular Causal and Feedback Mechanisms in Biological and Social Systems, these cybernetic conferences combine the innovators of the physical and biological sciences with those of the psychological and social sciences to tackle the, quote, comprehensive study of man. Thus, the core Macy's group expanded to include Norbert Wiener, an MIT mathematics professor and child prodigy who earned his PhD from Harvard at age 17 and studied under mathematician and political philosopher Lord Bertrand Russell, author of the seminal book establishing the modern rules of logic. John von Neumann, the Hungarian émigré and member of the Manhattan Project, who had become a pioneer of the digital computer,
The electronic computer.
and who used game theory to analyze Cold War strategic thinking. MIT mathematician Walter Pitts,
Mathematics has been called the one universal language of mankind.
who was self-taught in logic and co-authored several key papers on brain modeling with Warren McCullough. Raphael Lorente Deneau of the Rockefeller Institute of Medical Research, who had obsessively chronicled the action potentials of neurons and noted their compatibility with electronic and digital systems. German émigré and Gestalt psychologist Heinrich Kluwer, who studied visual perception, hallucinations, and mescaline as an experimental physiological psychologist, and was best known for Kluver-Bucy syndrome, a cognitive impairment triggered by surgically created brain lesions. German refugee and Gestalt psychologist Kurt Lewin, an OSS agent and director of MIT's Center for Group Dynamics, who was closely associated with the Frankfurt School and Tavistock Institute. Editor of the Macy's Conferences, second-order cybernetician Heinz von Forester ran the Pentagon-funded Biological Computer Laboratory at the University of Illinois. Born in Vienna and part of the infamous Vienna Circle, von Forester studied physics and conducted radar experiments for the Nazis and subsequently the Allied occupation. McCullough arranged for his academic position, permanent stay, and invitation to the Macy's Conference in 1949 after reading his work on the molecular basis of memory as a function of quantum mechanics. Along with these key participants were about a dozen other core members, as well as a handful of invited guests drawn from key positions of expertise. Macy's guests included OSS and CIA asset psychiatrist Harold Abramson, who worked on top-secret chemical warfare projects at Fort Detrick, some of which were co-sponsored by the Macy's Foundation itself, and who had run multiple MKUltra projects involving LSD experimentation. Dr. Abramson is also known for introducing LSD to many of the Macy's conference attendees including Macy's president Frank Fremont Smith and Gregory Bateson.
That's acid.
The attendees gathered together for 2 days at the Beekman Hotel, today a white-glove luxury condominium on the Upper East Side of Manhattan. The posh neighborhood may have seemed like an unlikely location, but not only was it next door to the Macy's Foundation, it was also just a few blocks away from the Council on Foreign Relations, which Allen Dulles had led for decades, and from the Rockefeller Institute for Medical Research and Cornell Medical College, where Project MKUltra research funds were channeled into the Human Ecology Fund. Rather than be based out of Washington, D.C., the wartime OSS operated out of its headquarters in room 3603 of Rockefeller Center, working side by side with Britain's MI6 and in the same building as the Rockefeller Foundation.
This machine has stored program, and that is the thing which makes the computer revolution possible.
John von Neumann took the stage to update everyone on the progress of the digital computer during the war.
The immense strides in computer technology that were spurred by von Neumann's work.
It was now ready for the next stage of exploitation.
The system calls for the key to be either up or down. The code calls for a dot or a dash.
Norbert Wiener's cybernetic concept held the key as to what they should do with the digital computers they had developed.
The method and the signal are such that they must be fed to the transmitter in a series of positive decisions.
It fused together the working principles of the biological organism, looping systems that maintained equilibrium.
Its maintenance is automatic and seeks to balance any disturbances.
Wiener, Rosenbluth, and Bigelow presented the ideas of their paper, Behavior, Teleology, and Purpose. It was written in 1943, but couldn't be published until 1947 due to secrecy. They had a universal mechanism to create goal-seeking behavior that made machines and even people basically programmable. On the influence of a feedback system, Wiener stated,
"The existing natural reflexes are essentially part of the same mechanism that can inform all purposeful activity in automata. One need merely supply a circuit with receptors and effectors."
Wenn ihr das Prinzip von Receptors und Effectors verstanden habt, versteht ihr MKUltra Algorithmen bei Facebook und bei Google wesentlich besser. Feedback Loop, Dislike, Plus-Like, Smile-Like. Was glaubt ihr, warum es das gibt? Das kommt alles aus der MKUltra-Forschung. Das ist alles, also dass ihr da ungefähr mal versteht, wer das Internet erfunden hat. Wer Google, Facebook, wer DARPA, wer das Skynet, wer diese Algorithmen, aus welchem Gedankenset das Ganze kommt. Wer die ganzen Leute gerade von den Namen, die da waren dann später bei Tavistock, Frankfurt School, die waren alle auf der Macy's Konferenz, die von 45 bis 53 ging.
Then they become goal-seeking devices.
Conference Chairman Warren McCullough had taken things a step further, showing how the operation of the human brain can be represented by on and off electric switching devices.
It is stop or go, on or off, one or none.
His 1943 paper with Walter Pitts on the logical calculus of neuronal activity introduced the concept of the neural net and showed how the communication of neurons could be modeled by a digital computer.
The mind, in contradistinction to brain and behavior, emerged in the 1950s as a legitimate object of experimental research. The Neural Nets project of McCullough and Pitts spearheaded this cognitivist turn in the 1940s. Science of mind thus became a science of signals based on binary logic. Neural nets bridge the gulf between body and mind, matter and form.
The comparisons between the central nervous system as an electronic machine and the digital computer as an artificial brain.
Also unser ganzer Körper, das Gehirn, ist ja alles nur mit Signalen und alles. Und wenn du die Signale manipulieren kannst von außen, also Kopf sagt Hand, heb dich und schlag zu, aber plötzlich sagt Funkmast, sagt Kopf und der Kopf sagt dann Hand und dann, darum geht's ja. Der Kopf weiß es nie, oder die Hand weiß dann nie, ob das Signal vom Kopf kommt oder vom Funkmast. Weil es ja bloß ein Signal. Ich weiß nicht, ob das stimmt, aber man kann, wenn jemand wütend ist, strahlt er eine bestimmte Frequenz aus. Wenn du die Frequenz aufnimmst, oder ich weiß nicht, wie man das aufnehmen soll, aber wenn man das rekordet und das dann über Großspanisch ausstrahlt, kannst du andere auch auf dieselbe bringen. So irgendwie. Das ist, also, das muss man verstehen, die haben das alles in Auschwitz erforscht. Das ist die ganze Auschwitz-Forschung. Nennt ihr heute Internet. Die ganzen Informationen, die sie für den PC-Bau, haben sie vorher aus dem Kopf. Und davor haben sie erstmal den Kopf untersucht. Verhaltensforschung. Wie oft musste jemand Stromschläge geben, bis er sich einreiht? Oder wie bei dem Film Lost, bei der Serie, wo sie mit den Eisbären, die immer hier die bestimmte Knopfkombination drücken mussten, damit sie ihr Fressen kriegen. Und wenn sie es falsch drücken, kriegen sie einen Stromschlag. Wenn du Tiere abrichten kannst, wenn du Flipper abrichten kannst, dann kannst du auch über Facebook, der einzige Fehler, den sie immer hatten, der nie berechenbar war, das war diese emotionale Schiene. Gefühle, Liebe und so. Das brachte dann immer, das Gefühle, Liebe, das ist dann nie 1 und 0. Das macht dann hier, und da gab es Probleme. Sobald Emotionen reinkommen, kannst du den Menschen nicht mehr mit dem Computer verbinden. Dann ist, deswegen wollen die ja den Menschen ja so gerne runterregulieren, auf 0 Emotionen.
Boiled down to questions of logic, mathematics, and the very nature of reality itself.
Very simply, in the first place, I wanted to find out what was going in the brain.
For McCullough, it was always an esoteric quest to find the nature of reality in quantifiable and technical terms.
Head of the Department of Cybernetics at MIT, psychologist, psychiatrist, neurophysiologist, engineer, mathematician, American, a confirmed eccentric, a genuine Renaissance man.
The first answers to his questions came during the tail end of World War I. Yale's wartime ROTC training instructor in chemical warfare was none other than Professor
Bertram Borden Boltwood, head of the chemistry department and an expert in chemical warfare.
Boltwood, who'd come from a wealthy family of skull and bones initiates, was on the front lines of discovering the inner world of the atom.
Also, ein Experte von chemischer Kriegsführung. Skull and Bones. Reiche Familie. No, also, dass ihr auch mal das Verständnis, wer das Ganze erfunden hat, aus welchem Gedankenset das kommt. Und wenn ihr das verstanden habt, versteht ihr auch jeden einzelnen Move, den Trump jetzt gerade macht. Das ist wichtig, wenn du weißt, wer ganz genau die Täter sind und siehst, gegen wen Trump vorgeht, dann kannst du abhaken.
And the first to discover evidence of radioactive decay of uranium in lead. A chosen initiate, Professor Boltwood invited young McCullough to his home to discuss the hidden history of science from its mysterious beginnings.
It was just before the Great War ended that he invited me to his home for an uninterrupted talk.
Genau so läuft es ab. Der Professor lädt denjenigen, den er für teuflisch genug hält, abends zu sich nach Hause ein und bespricht mit ihm die verborgene oder nicht erzählte, also das, was sie uns nie erzählen. Er weiht ihn ein in geheimes Wissen und macht ihn neugierig, macht ihn geil, wie als wenn du einem kleinen Jungen zum ersten Mal Brüste zeigst. Das gleiche, als wenn du einem Wissenschaftler geheimes Wissen zeigst. Ja, dann lockst du ihn und dann fickst du ihn. Das machen die Freimacher oder die Skull and Bones, das machen die immer so. Sie locken dich.
He complained to me of his increasing forgetfulness and asked me to spend one evening, 5 p.m. to 5 a.m., with him to illuminate the larger picture. He grabbed me by the hands and intently revealed to me the hidden history of science from its mysterious beginnings.
Knowledge was passed down through the centuries and closely guarded by the initiates.
Between ancient Egypt, Mesopotamia, the Phoenicians, Babylonia, and beyond.
All shared the mysterious keys to governing early civilizations.
Cybernetic at heart, these inherited secrets fueled the minds of the ancient philosophers and mathematicians.
Thereafter, priest classes, secret societies, and elite organizations of learned men.
After summing up this history of scientific progress, he paused. The room went silent. And he said, if you want to get behind the fake explanation of how our world comes to be as it is, then you must find the facts for yourself and accept nothing in addition but logic and mathematics.
In an interview years later with counterculture icon Stuart Brand, Margaret Mead and
An der Stelle muss ich auch noch mal kurz rein. Wenn der sagt nichts anderes als Logik und Mathematik, dann heißt das auch keine Ethik und keine Moral. Ihr müsst immer an Sheldon Cooper denken bei sowas. Ja? Der sich dann fragt, wie jetzt? Ja, Sheldon Cooper wäre so ein Mensch, der würde auch hier, Leute, weil, was ist denn falsch daran? Ist doch nur logisch. Na, das ist dieser, wenn alles nur noch logisch ist, dieses Spock oder Kirk, Herz oder Logik. Das war ja das, was die Deutschen gerade so einzigartig gemacht hat, dass sie beides ja vereint haben. Dieses Herz und die Logik. Aber auch in der Wissenschaft. Wo die anderen halt nur dieses Logik ohne Herz. Wo dann sowas wie Explosionsantrieb, ne, oder Verbrennungsmotor. Während die Deutschen sagten, nee, Gott baut auf, Gott zerstört nie, also muss da was anderes sein. Das ist eine ganz andere Herangehensweise.
Gregory Bateson admitted that McCullough constructed the meetings around a, quote, grand design, shaping who would speak and in what order over a 5-year period. When Brand asked Bateson what McCullough's grand strategy was, Bateson simply replied, "Who knows?" What was the common code between the communication of...
Das ist ja das, was viele nicht verstehen. Wenn es dann an den Punkt kommt, Massenkontrolle. Und wenn du allen immer einredest, sie haben keine Chance und es kommt Atomkrieg. Change the image, ist ja das, ne? Oder die Vorstellungskraft. Wenn die Leute schon davon ausgehen, dass sie keine Chance haben und dass Atomkrieg kommt. Aber wenn sie davon ausgehen, dass Weltfrieden kommt, dann regen sie sich ja über Atomkrieg auf. Wenn du aber jeden Tag sagst, du hast keine Chance. Oder wie die Mädchen immer, Mathe, ich krieg eine 6. Na klar wird's dann eine 6. Ich bin zu jeder Mathearbeit rangegangen, also ich krieg wieder eine 1. Alles andere wäre ein Skandal, dann muss ich mit der Lehrerin nochmal reden, das geht so nie. Weil ich krieg so oder so wieder eine 1. Wenn das war das Universum schuld, dann müssen wir mal hier. Es ist immer auch so eine Herangehenssache. Deswegen habe ich ja einfach Weltfrieden vorne an die Tafel dran geschrieben. Change the image in your mind. Das ist ganz einfach. Das ist, also, wenn man das immer verstanden hat, dann ist es, wenn man es sinnvoll nutzt. Das ist ja bei allem so, ne? Du kannst Fernsehen sinnvoll nutzen oder für Verbrechen. Du kannst jeden einzelnen Aspekt. Du kannst HARP sinnvoll nutzen oder für Verbrechen. Du kannst G5 sinnvoll nutzen oder für Verbrechen. Du kannst das Finanzsystem sinnvoll nutzen oder für Verbrechen. Es geht immer beides. Je nachdem, wie man es halt nutzt. Oder wer an der Macht ist.
The nervous system and the computer's binary processing language. They wanted to show the effect of the physical world on the mind in statistical terms with data. Input, output. Eventually, all the entities will sync to the dominant, whichever is making the most accurate and reliable long-term decisions, whoever is setting the pace and the trends, which could carry out any number of simultaneous calculations and feed back into the mental loop.
immer in den Mental Feedback Loop ein. Wie oft musst du donnerstags Denzel Washington gucken, erst der Anschlag und dann Ausnahmezustand, bis du dann verstehst, dass wenn es in Real passiert, erst der Anschlag und dann Ausnahmezustand. Wie oft musst du den Film geguckt haben mit Denzel Washington, bis du dann automatisch, wenn es in Real passiert, automatisch das machst und dann dich fügst. Man richtet Leute ab. Hätten die euch die letzten 30 Jahre Bienchen und Blümchen gezeigt, hättet ihr erwartet, dass Bienchen und Blümchen kommen. Weil sie euch aber Atomkrieg zeigen, erwarten alle, dass Atomkrieg kommt und finden sich halt damit ab. Ja, und jetzt sage ich Weltfrieden und die Leute finden sich damit ab. Der Geist ist einfach gestrickt. Ihr glaubt nie, ne? Das ist wirklich so simpel. Statt Atomkrieg, Weltfrieden. Und die Menschen finden sich mit Weltfrieden ab. Das ist so freakig. Ne? Deswegen habe ich mich darüber aufgeregt, dass nie einfach jemand mal vorne an die Tafel Weltfrieden angeschrieben hat. So als, wo wir hinwollen. No, einfach mal so. Warum hat das nicht schon vor 70 Jahren einer gemacht? Aber egal.
Implied by this research was the hope for a technology for controlling behavior via the second signal system, using information inputs as causative agents rather than chemical agents, electrodes, or other more exotic techniques applicable perhaps to individuals rather than groups. C. This new trend, observed in the early post-Stalin period, continues. By 1960, the word cybernetics was used by the Soviets to designate this new trend. This new science is considered by some as the key to understanding the human brain and the product of its functioning, psychic activity and personality, to the development of means for controlling it, and to ways for molding the character of the new communist man.
The airborne computer is no longer a theory, nor an experiment. It's a fact, tested, functioning, practical, and restricted. It has gone into production under the label BRAIN.
Macy's was meshing the power of language, communication, and the symbolic exchange of information with the biological modes of control, sowing seeds in 1,000 directions.
A psychologist was involved in this experiment, along with a biophysicist and a physiologist.
This was the birth of personal computers, robotics, satellites, and artificial intelligence.
Und jetzt überlegt nochmal, zu welcher Zeit IBM die Technologie nach Deutschland schickte und zu welcher Zeit die ganzen Studien 1942 anfingen. Und ob ihr dann zwischen Verhaltensstudien, amerikanischen PC-Startern und Wiener Wissenschaftlern, die dann später gerettet wurden, irgendeine Verbindung findet, die dann zur Macy's-Konferenz, zur DARPA, zur CIA, zur Skynet und zur God AI führt. Wahrscheinlich schon.
From the very beginning, models created in the digital computer of the brain were also inversely symbolic of the mechanization of the mind, which might one day be conquered one neuron at a time.
As he finds the correct path, he registers the information in his memory. Theseus is an electrically controlled mouse. He has the ability to solve problems by trial and error means and then remember the solution, and something perhaps akin to a brain.
A counterpart to Macy's, the Ratio Club was formed in 1949 in the UK. McCullough gave the keynote at the first meeting. Alan Turing, W. Ross Ashby, Gray Walter, and Donald McKay were among its most important members.
Now meet Dr. Gray Walter of Bristol. His mechanical tortoise has an electronic brain which functions like the human mind, sensitive to both light and touch. Dr. Walter says that his electronic toys work exactly as though they have a simple two-cell nervous system, and that with more cells they could do many more tricks.
But Gray Walter was more deeply involved in the study of brainwave activity itself.
Present-day radio and television techniques afford an opportunity to probe into the brain.
Mapping the relaxed states of mind characterized by alpha waves, and Walter was the first to experimentally produce changes in brain waves through the use of flickering light.
Now I'm going to flash a bright light at you.
Changing die Waves in deinem Gehirn durch Flickerlight, durch flickerndes Licht, flackerndes. Ne? Lasst euch das einfach auf der Zunge zergehen. Norbert Wiener erforscht, wie das flickernde Licht das Verhalten in deinen Kopfwellen von Alpha zu was auch immer für Wellen. Die haben jeden Aspekt getestet. Hm?
Keep your eyes closed and please try not to move. That's good.
Gray Walter had also worked closely with Norbert Wiener, introducing him in the early 30s to the then mysterious field of brainwave interpretation.
For each stimulus to a sense organ starts not one, but a train of impulses which are easily followed electrically with a cathode ray or other oscillograph.
The discussion began at von Neumann's request, a conversation about consciousness as to whether there is an anatomical substrate for what has everybody knowing things. Von Bonnen held it was probably not cerebral cortex that determined awareness, but more likely something in the midbrain, and I suggested the importance of the thalamus. Fremont Smith went into the different degrees of consciousness from full attention through twilight states to sleep and hysterical amnesias. Molly Hauer described the stimulation of the cortex she witnessed under Dr. Penfield, which did not disturb the patients, yet threw them into a panic when stimulation caused vocalization resembling speech. The distinction between consciousness and awareness.
Members of the Macy's conferences, including Frank Fremont Smith, Margaret Mead, Clyde Kluckholm, Henry W. Brosen, and Molly Harwer, also sat on the governing board of the International Committee on Mental Hygiene.
Oh my God. Oh no, don't let them take me in there.
Headed by John Rawlings Rees, creator of the Rockefeller Foundation-funded Tavistock Institute and the British Army's chief psych warfare expert during World War II. Mental hygiene went global.
Nächste. Psychologische Kriegsführung arbeitet mit Frankfurt School beim Krieg gegen ein besetztes Land. Könnte man jetzt glatt sagen. Hä? Es ist, wer es nie kennt, The Minds of Men. Das ist die beste Dokumentation, die es zu diesem Thema gibt. Preisgekrönt. 3 Stunden 45 geht's. Na, aber bloß erstmal, damit ihr auf das Thema reinkommt. Ihr könnt ruhig auch die Sendung teilen. Das ist so etwas, was ich nie allzu lange online lasse, so eine Sendung. Weil sie zu geil ist und die Gefahr, dass die Leute deswegen rumzicken, ist zu groß. Deswegen teilt lieber, dass sie jetzt zugucken, bevor es dann wieder weg ist.
Global, and a massive conference was convened in London in 1948.
Can serve as a springboard for more meaningful discussion and think about.
Wieder ist es pyramidal. Ne? Achtet einfach auf die Symbolik. Dann seht ihr, es ist, welche Universitäten und welche Freimaurer und welche Logen dort überall waren. Es ist, man sieht immer wieder dieselben Freaks, dieselben Leute, dieselben Gedanken-Mindsets.
The nature of the problem.
To mold the post-war New World man, starting inside his own head.
Because it enables the individual to fit into an orderly system. Being a member of an organized group offers a basis for emotional stability to every man.
Heavily funded by the British and American governments and the private philanthropic foundations.
Dauerhafte Stabilität der Emotionen. Also null Emotion ist dauerhaft stabil. Ja?
It almost seemed like a global Manhattan Project for the mind was kicking off.
But we all have our problems. You've got to pull yourself together, and this will all work out all right.
It culminated in a report authored by the Cybernetics Conference members, Lawrence Frank and Margaret Mead, and was titled Mental Health and World Citizenship. citizenship, which focused on the modifiability of man and all of his social institutions.
They come from all sorts of homes, these patients, all kinds of backgrounds. But somewhere along the line, life became too much for them.
Political, economic, legal, and religious. His family, his school, and his workplace.
How wrong I was. Or no, not wrong, sick. And now that I'm well again, I can't help feeling just a little sad, the way you always do.
In order to influence and change the world's behavior, one human being at a time. It stated, quote, "The sciences of man offer the hope of a new approach to the problem of war and a world community, and it is the ultimate goal of mental health to help men to live with their fellows in one world, so that men can live together in peace with each other."
Ja? Einfach auf der Zunge zu gehen lassen. Das Ziel ist, dass sich alle bestens miteinander verstehen. Also diesen neuen Menschen zu programmieren. Den perfekten Sklaven. Es ist... also, damit ihr wisst, aus welchem Gedankenset diese verrückten Ideen sind.
For shock treatment, help Fred to draw away from his feelings of antagonism and suspicion and move closer to reality.
Because of this, they determined, quote, "The goal of mental health has been enlarged from a concern about the development of healthy personalities to the larger task of creating a healthy society."
But whatever the mode of treatment, it's essential that it be supplemented by an atmosphere of security and calm. The effective hospital must always serve as a refuge for its patients, a place where they can live quietly during that period of reorientation in which they learn how to achieve a better adjustment to the world outside.
Out of the conference, a supposedly scientific World Federation of Mental Health was established. John Rawlings Rees left the Tavistock Institute to become its first president, a seat that both Fremont Smith and Meade would later fill as well. The group's motto, borrowed from the UNESCO Constitution, was, quote, "Since wars begin in the minds of men, it is in the minds of men that the defenses of peace must be constructed."
The problem became one of communication between man and machine, between machine and machine, between machine and man.
There was a large military presence at the Macy's cybernetic meetings. Perhaps not surprising given how many contracts its core members had with Naval, Air Force, and Army research, all of which were later exposed as routine fronts for CIA endeavors.
Jetzt sind wir wieder beim nächsten Punkt. Nicht nur die Gesellschaft umgestalten, es ging ja auch hier schon die Gedanken vom genetisch veränderten Soldaten, vom Klonsoldaten bis hin Mensch, Maschine, Cyborg. Das war dann der nächste Step, ne? Also MK Ultra 1.0, MK Ultra 2.0 war Remote Viewing und MK Ultra 4.0 ist halt Cyborg-Chip im Kopf. Über Satelliten angesteuert. Und alles über CIA-Fronts, mit Militärleuten drin, mit den verrückten Wissenschaftlern aus Auschwitz, plus Frankfurt School, Tavistock, Echelon, Rancorp, die sich dann alle in der DARPA trafen und am Ende Facebook, Amazon, Google und Apple rauskamen. Das muss man immer bedenken, ne?
These meetings bring together field representatives.
Nehmen wir mal Siri und Alexa, ne? Feedback Loop, Siri und Alexa, sie sagt dir immer nur das, was du hören sollst. Es gibt nur noch eine Antwort. Siri sagt dir niemals zwei, sagt nur eine.
Simulation data people with their background of environmental information and military personnel, the ultimate users of the programs.
The Office of Naval Research had its own branch for investigating physiological psychology, basically another name for cybernetics.
Man, which we have put in between two already known machines. Man is a predictor and says, I shall continue to do whatever my last solution predicted will be right, so long as no detectable difference arises. I'm very curious to know just how far we can push this human operator.
Would you please describe?
In which part of the brain should they screw the spark plug? So we have the human operator surrounded on both sides by very precisely known mechanisms. And the question comes up, what kind of a...
Ihr müsst das mit dem flackernden Licht anders verstehen. Früher gab's die Kerze und das hat dich ja eher beruhigt. Jetzt ist die Frage, kann man das auch andersrum? Na, es gibt ja eine bestimmte Art des Flackerns beruhigt dich, wie bei einer Kerze. Oder wenn sie kurz flackert, dann merkst du, irgendwas passiert, irgendein Windhauch oder so. Ja, das sind ja... Und wenn man das dann aber verstanden hat und das dann manipulieren kann, weil es geht ja immer erst darum, erst zu verstehen. Wer kommt denn jetzt? Moment.
Machine have we placed in the middle? What kind of a machine is man?
The needs that power the human machine, that influence human behavior. Let's take a man. Any man.
Man, the maker. Tools would give him control over his own world, organization, and extension, using strategy for dominance and survival.
You see, in the chain, the end man sends a message and then he has nothing else to do. He merely waits for the answer to come back.
Man splits into groups, tribes, cults of information, and behavior propagated through rituals.
The number of messages sent, of course, correlates highly with where you are in the group.
Clusters of knowledge, careful note of mysteries and breakthroughs, spilling forth in useful language, not open source, but guarded secrets of power.
If we play this game on paper, we get almost exactly the operation one gets with an actual group.
The modification of the synapse. Neurons that fire together, wire together. Hebb proved that.
I would like to follow that remark. When we were talking this morning, von Neumann was saying that the brain could not be an analog calculating machine, but must be a digital one.
A machine with an analogic part and a digital part.
So the analog part is able to create analogies that mirror observed actions in human beings with whom we communicate.
Such a device may also use data from previous experience to predict the future.
A tapestry woven from the memories of past sensations.
What are you? I can't tell where this is going. Depends on where you want to.
Curiouser and curiouser. What kind of place is this?
What I see when I look at you is, in fact, my image of you. Or you see your image of me. The how of using our senses is a deeply concealed body of knowledge. Very few people seem to realize the enormous theoretical power of this distinction between what I see and what is actually out there. Most assume that they see what they look at, but the map is not the territory. What gets from the territory to the map, i.e. from the outside world to the brain, is news of difference, motion for instance. If there is no difference in the territory, there's nothing to say on the map.
After creating his neural nets model with pits, the McCullough's MIT team would write what the frog's eye tells the brain. Perception. Our brains translated and converted analog symbols embedded in our sense receptors into digital data in our brain. It isn't reality that we see, but rods and cones interpreting the shapes and shadows and colors of the real world. For frogs, it meant an eye trained to see primarily flies and bugs, a worldview that was easily tricked and fooled by forms and puppets and other forgeries. Human senses were tricked by many things in the labs, along with practically every other animal species that had been tested.
Why do the two heads seem to change size? Answer, the windows are distorted.
Plato's famous allegory of the cave. Reality is nothing more than shadow puppets projected on the cave walls.
It goes all the way around. It's an optical illusion.
But even though you tell me, my eyes still won't believe it.
When you run circles around the military's technologically driven future, the nerves of the Army and Navy and Air Force, the communication networks of signals and intercepts of planes, tanks, boats, missiles, and torpedoes, when you run circles around the whole of human society and its various cycles of influence and modification, and when you run circles around the individual, circles around the problem of the machine and man himself. And once you go around and around the problem of feedback and the cycles of behavior, the responses of Pavlovian conditioning, perception, and reality, in the end, the whole of man can be controlled through his dependence on his environment. Because the mind is contained within the brain-body mechanism, and thus isolated from the outside world, it is entirely dependent upon information derived from the senses. In other words, the mind is already contained within a natural matrix.
Focused on communication, their main purpose of indicating to what extent science suffers from the babble of its many tongues, and hence how necessary it is for us to learn to speak again to one another.
The transmitter previously feedback systems must operate message, channel, detect its function, see on-off knowledge of the electrical impulse transmitted constant feedback information back into the message and delivered to the destination.
Many of the cybernetics members were now talking literally about constructing an artificial matrix.
A matrix is supposed to give birth, not receive. And yet what I want to talk about is very definitely the birth of a matrix. The matrix has been a growing thing, getting more and more complex, wider and wider in its scope, and, I believe, more and more fertile as time has gone on.
Pattern comes from pater, the father, a stamp. Then the papa is making again and again children of himself. What is a complementary to pattern? It's a matrix. Look at the matrix which embeds. Yes. So everything is sitting in one big thing embedded in a matrix.
As Alex Bavelis of MIT noted in his group dynamics studies,
we are attempting now to describe the operation of a net in terms of the probability that there will be a message from A to B in a given time period. We plot the net as a matrix. We put ones where there is a link, and zeros where there is no direct link.
At stake was the unveiling of an entirely new paradigm, one which encompassed a holistic view of control that could potentially govern the world and the mind. The system they came up with required that individuals and society be placed in a common communications network.
The eye of the beholder sees a strange new technology.
It all centered around man-computer symbiosis.
Things are going to be considerably better for a lot of people when and if we ever get changed over to an essentially electronic base.
As this network evolved, the internet developed into an artificial nervous system. Like other Macy's attendees, J.C.R. Licklider had been activated by wartime research. His experiments in modeling the human brain with psychoacoustic factors at Harvard overlapped with secretive contract work that revolved around how the human nervous system reacted to electronic stimuli.
Behavior tied to appetite was couched in the same terms as that for self-steering torpedoes and self-training guns.
Like so many computers, machines, and other controllable factors, man could be placed in a technical loop, and his behavior modified.
Yes, I see. Do go on.
A psychologist and computer scientist, Licklider embodied the connection between cybernetics and Cold War air defense, which was largely based out of Boston and MIT. His presence at the 1950 Macy's Cybernetic meeting coincided with his move to MIT and the start of a pivotal but shadowy role in creating the militarized MIT Lincoln Laboratory, the SAGE radar network, and the DEW line, or Distant Early Warning Missile Defense System.
A radar early warning line north.
A system which relied upon the very command and control communication networks that Norbert Wiener and others at Macy's created. Ultimately, the nerves of the nation's defense were designed to operate like the human nervous system.
And so headquarters, United States Air Force, arrived at a command and control concept with data processing as its nerve center. Its basic function, to extend the useful capacity of man's brain.
Switched to digital communication technology, aided and abetted by satellite. The melding of computers and communication.
A fact which influenced Licklider's vision for a networked and interconnected society.
And then to interconnect each of the computers to each other to form a fully connected network.
That would eventually culminate in the DARPA-created ARPANET, the forerunner to the modern internet.
Research now going on will someday permit a network user to log in.
Will someday permit a network user to log in.
The important thing to realize about systems is how they are controlled. And we must get rid of any notion straight away that control is something imposed on the system from outside. It has to be built into it. Let's see how the mechanism works. You see it lifting here, transmitting the message along here, lifting that cam up here, and then shutting off a valve there. That is built into the system. It's called feedback, and feedback is ubiquitous in control systems.
At this point, we realize that reality itself is not a fixed thing, as our nervous systems interpret the symbols and signals of familiar patterns and changes, continuously revising our image of the world. Thus, an artificial matrix is inherent, indeed unavoidable.
These systems which are minds are circuits of cause and effect. They are cybernetic systems. For me, the system is man and environment.
Man sought to control his own kind by way of understanding what governed his actions, starting with the neuron, base unit of mind-body communication.
What is cybernetics? A railway train needs no steering gear. The forces required to correct for the buffetings of wind and way are supplied automatically by sideways reaction of the rails against the wheel flanges. A ship, lacking such implicit means of guidance, requires a helm, normally controlled by a helmsman. The Latin for helmsman is jubinator. The Greek, kybernetes. From the first comes our word cybernetics, la cybernetique, to denote the science of government.
In the end, cybernetic modification of the human being makes information and its communication the key to control, making reality itself malleable, and our interaction with the technology at hand has created its own feedback derived from our interpreted reality.
The world about us is accessible only through a nervous system, and that our information concerning it is confined to what limited information the nervous system can transmit.
As this technology captures, measures, and analyzes the world around us, man is programmed and reprogrammed through continuous updates provided by this intermediary. And conditioning comes with it, along with new reflexes.
And, specifically, it is a recursive epistemology, and based upon recursiveness of cycles, returning all the time to bite their own beginnings.
Cybernetics programmed in the same base human language, self-reflexive cycles, feedback and adaptation. Our very essence is conflicted with the environment and yet dependent upon interacting within it.
Yet the old worm Ouroboros is an odd worm, who conceals not only his recursive nature, but also the implications of recursiveness.
The Ouroboros is the perfect symbol for Kubernetes.
Ultimately, the underlying natural matrix is supplanted by an artificial one, born with the collective consciousness of mankind's total intent, goals, and purpose. Ultimately, they found that programming was easy enough anyway. The science of cybernetics would reveal to the CIA, or any serious agency making inquiries, that although the mind itself could not be directly controlled, it was in essence malleable due to its reliance upon physical sense data and man's unique ability to comprehend language and to talk. Behavior then, modified by continuous feedback, was inherent in communication itself. The ultimate question was, who or what would control the signal? Reports from the first 5 of the 10 Macy's Cybernetics conferences were never publicly released. These 10 meetings systematically worked out questions of control that would have to be asked and could only be answered through experimentation, some of which would prove so unethical it could only be carried out under a blanket of national security on a need-to-know basis. The last cybernetics meeting was held April 22, 1953, just 9 days after Alan Dulles signed off on MKUltra. Norbert Wiener lamented,
Those of us who have contributed to the new science of cybernetics thus stand in a moral position, which is to say the least not very comfortable. We have contributed to the initiation of a new science which embraces technological developments with great possibilities for good and evil.
This was especially so since the computing machine had already reached a point of such complexity that it threatened man's freedom to make individual decisions.
We do not have a choice in suppressing these new technological developments. We can only hand it over to the world that exists about us. There are those who hope for the good of a better understanding of man and society that may anticipate and outweigh the incidental contribution we are making to the concentration of power. I am compelled to say that it is a very slight hope.
The speed of military and technological development in our century leaves no margin for guesswork, no time for the leisurely trial and error of yesterday.
Cyber evolved beyond the passive reception of one-way signals, as with television. Instead, it required a feedback loop of interaction.
Would you advocate a world ruled by scientists and by the super brains?
No. We are fit for discovering how the world works. We're not fit for telling other people what to do.
At a conference in 1968, shortly before his death, Warren McCullough remarked, "Man, to my mind, is about the nastiest, most destructive of all the animals. And I don't see any reason, if he can evolve machines that can have more fun than he himself can, why shouldn't they take over, enslave us, quite happily.
We used to argue about whether a computer can think. The answer is no. What thinks is a total circuit, including perhaps a computer, a man, and an environment.
If you could control the environment, control the environment, the environment, the environment, the environment, the environment.
All of the circumstances to which the individual must react to the environment in which he lives.
Similarly, we may ask whether a brain can think, and again, the answer is no.
He has to work by cycles of operation, very much like an ordinary mechanical computer. He does very many complicated things.
What thinks is a brain inside a man who is part of a system which includes an environment.
If you can get to the man at the switches, if you get to the man at the switches, then you can get to the real man.
Scientists are not interested in controlling other people. They're interested in finding out how the world really works. Now, look, I'm not even able to run a gang of 20 people, and I've had 50 under me. No. To run the world, no. No scientist is fit for that.
As one Soviet author puts it, cybernetics can be used in molding of a child's character, the inculcation of knowledge and techniques, the amassing of experience, the establishment of social behavior patterns, all functions which can be summarized as control of the growth process of the individual. Students of particular disciplines in the USSR, such as psychologists and social scientists, also support the general cybernetic trend.
Viewing the MKUltra subprojects again through the lens of these new cybernetic models of man and his mind, we find elements of the Macy's conferences woven into the agency's unethical experiments to control human beings throughout the Cold War. Case in point is Subproject 119. Its admitted aim was an interpretive survey of work being done in psychophysiological research and instrumentation, with 5 goals stated simply by order of operations. A. Bioelectric sensors, sources of significant electrical potential and methods of pickup. B. Recording, amplification, electronic tape, and other multi-channel recording. C. Analysis, autocorrelators, spectrum analyzers, etc., and coordination with automatic data processing equipment. D. Standardization of data for correlation with biochemical, physiological, and behavioral indices. And once they had all that figured out, E. Techniques of activation of the human organism by remote electronic means. Time revealed the principal on Subproject 119 was Dr. Saul B. Sells, who moved to Texas Christian University after spending a decade with the Air Force School of Aviation Medicine at Randolph Field and working as a statistician for the government during World War II. Sells specialized in crunching data to extract patterns and insights about behavior. Founding the Institute of Behavior Research at TCU, he tabulated the importance of hundreds of factors and environmental conditions that trigger man's predictive behavior. Along with the Air Force and NASA, Sells spent decades quietly carrying out various research projects for the Office of Naval Research, which even sponsored a symposium at TCU with Sells and fellow MKUltra-funded researcher Muzaffar Sharif on the stimulus determinants of behavior in 1961. One of Cell's first projects at TCU in 1959 was to send a proposal to the CIA regarding psychophysiological research to investigate electrical signals from the human brain and other systems, and the development of a more advanced multi-channel electronic analyzer to interpret those signals. The CIA responded to these objectives, which it discussed at some length with Cells, before appointing him as a supposedly unwitting participant in charge of MKUltra subproject 119. The work lasted almost 6 years through 1965, and was funneled through the Society for the Investigation of Human Ecology, later exposed as a CIA front run by Harold G. Wolff and Lawrence Hinkle out of Cornell Medical Institute, right across the street from the Rockefeller Institute for Medical Research on the Upper East Side of Manhattan.
Okay, this is their perception of it, if I could
No,
just continue.
it wasn't their perception of it either. No, it wasn't.
Dangerous to his being, contrary to any previous consciously expressed intentions and interests, contrary to the good of the individual, and subversive to the goals for which he is consciously working.
I understand all this talk. But the situation was, you see, those things were never done because of wise people on both sides. We not able to do this nor interested in it.
They were, though.
Some of the low-level people were, but the high-level people were not, to tell you the truth.
The bioelectronics directories the CIA commissioned Cells to compile included a detailed Rolodex of invasive neurological research projects at countless institutions, being carried out by countless professionals. And yet the names that come up again and again reveal what a small world it really is. Not to mention multiple scientists who were later exposed as running their own MKUltra subprojects. What did 119 really mean by techniques of activation of the human organism by remote electronic means?